So, welcome, Felipe Fernández-Armesto, to the Burning Archive
Thank you
podcast.
very much. Thank you very much for having me.
I guess you're one of the world's most distinguished historians
Sorry,
of the world.
are you still talking to me?
You're too modest, too modest. And I've been reading your work for, I don't know, 20, 25 years, so I'm very familiar with your work. But I guess for listeners and viewers... Sorry?
You don't look old enough. You don't look old enough.
Yeah, that's very flattering of you. But for listeners and viewers, I wonder if you could just give us a quick snapshot of what your kind of perspective on world history is.
Well, I try to use the world as a unit of study to see it all at once, as if, looking down from the cosmic crow's nest from the perspective of what I call a galactic observer. And I think that if you try to do that, first of all, you do see connections that would otherwise be invisible, both, what technically people call diachronic and synchronic, or so across time and through time. And you can also see it's almost like trying to contrive the perspective of God, for whom presumably time is a very different sort of thing from the way we experience it. And usually historians are obsessed by chronology. I mean, I've never been any good at dates. I never remember a date. So in a way, I kind of escape from the constraints of chronology by trying to see the world whole. And I think if you do that, if you adopt the perspective of the galactic observer, if you ask how she sees the world, and I use feminine pronoun here, not for reasons of political correctness, but because the only omniscient and omnipresent observer I know is my wife. So I tend to think that the galactic observer must be of the same sex. So when she looks down on us, what does she see? That's the question that I ask. What is it that's really going on all over the world? Or at least all over so much of it, that the parts of it that aren't affected are interestingly anomalous. So that's right. So attempt to see the world all at once. All at once.
And you've sort of written, I guess, from some unusual perspectives as well. I mean, you've got a Spanish family background, but you have worked and lived in Britain, and you, I guess, live and work in America as well. So you've got three sort of countries there, but you've also kind of brought together cultural history and environmental history and, I guess, perspectives from like traditional history and evolutionary biological sort of history as well. How's that sort of shape your perspective on world history?
Yes, well, it's true. Yes, well, quite rightly, quite make me sound like a sort of intellectual flippity gibbet, and it's perfectly true. Like, I can't stick to one thing or to one discipline. And I suppose really the sort of these multiple perspectives do come easily to me because of my very mixed cultural background. I mean, I always think of myself as Spanish. I mean, my mother-in-law, God rest her soul, who travelled in Spain with me, said that it was like being with a werewolf, because when I was in an English-speaking environment, I was exaggeratedly and unconvincingly English. And when I was in Spain, I was equally unconvincingly and equally exaggeratedly Spanish. So I would say, obviously, having those two cultures to start off with is a great help. And you're right that I have adjusted very happily to working in the United States. And, I mean, everybody hates America, but in many ways it's a lovely country with lovely people. It's a great privilege to to work there. So I feel kind of at home. Whenever I cross the Atlantic, when I come back to Europe, I think to myself, how lovely, I'm home. And then when I go back to the United States, I think to myself, how lovely, I'm home. So it is in a way, you know, I suppose my life has equipped me to transcend frontiers, and they don't mean a tremendous amount to me. I don't think I've got an ounce of sort of national feeling really anywhere in my bloodstream. And obviously that is that is a great advantage. Strangely, I think it's a great advantage when you come to look at nations and peoples and states as units of study, which I sometimes do within this effort that I've already described of looking at the world as a whole, because obviously it gives you kind of an objectivity. You know, I mean, I can see the history of Britain and the United States and Spain, warts and all, and I don't repine. You know, it doesn't worry me that, for example, the history of the United States is that of a country, you know, born in rebellion, nurtured in slavery, forged in civil war, and emerging into, you know, the world's great superpower by dint of, you know, terrible imperial sort of imposition on other peoples. That's all true of the history of the United States. Yet at the same time, I can see that overall, the effect of the United States on the history of the world has been, broadly speaking, very benign. And, you know, I think it's very similar if I'm looking at the British Empire or the Spanish global monarchy. I can see, you know, where they went wrong morally, and also, you know, in practical terms, because neither of those empires was particularly good at keeping its subject peoples alive, and that's actually, you know, the most basic duty of any polity, to keep your people alive. So I can see their, you know, their failures and shortcomings, but I can also see the, you know, the benignity and charity very often that inspired some of the makers of those empires. So I think it's an advantage, you know, not to be imprisoned in one perspective. And of course, I've always been very interested, from an imperial point of view, I've always been very interested in the perspective of indigenous people, because in most empires, they are, you know, the largest group. Not so much in Australia for a very long time, but you know, typically it's the indigenes who make empires what they really are, and I think, again, not for reasons of political correctness, but just to find out the truth and to see what it was really like to be in one of those empires. You've got to adopt an indigenous perspective. The course that I try to teach at the University of Notre Dame, which is where I belong, on Native American documents in Native American languages in the early colonial period of the Spanish monarchy, is perhaps the most rewarding course I've ever devised, and one that I like doing best.
That's fascinating. Well, I'd love to come back to that maybe a bit later, but I mean, you've talked about big nations and empires, and you've also written what I find a brilliant book on civilizations, but you once also said that the most important subject in world history is something everyone knows a bit about, which is food. What do you see as the importance of food in world history?
Well, it's the thing that you can't do that. So to leave it out, and obviously nowadays historians are very well aware of this, and there's a lot of scholarship on the history of food. But when I started, at one point in my career, I was a professor of environmental history, and when I wanted to give my students something to read about food, which is absolutely essential to environmental history, because this is where we encounter the environment most intimately. It's when we eat it. So I really wanted them to have access to something readable on the history of food, and there wasn't anything, so I kind of had to write the book myself, and obviously I did find it very, very instructive. You know, one of my hopes was that it would give me a pretext for eating a lot under the guise of doing research, and somehow I never managed to eat enough to make it tax deductible. So that's my take on food is essentially that it's an aspect of environmental history, but it's also, of course, culture and economy. So my book on the history of food tries to cover, the culture, the economics, and the ecology of food all in one book. And I guess that was what was new and distinctive about it. And why, one time it seemed to be terribly successful. I never look at my royalty checks, but I don't think I think it's kind of, rather been displaced now by other books.
I was checking in on that book just in preparation for the interview, because there's been a big discussion in Australia recently about whether the Indigenous people in Australia, the Aborigines, were whether they practiced agriculture, I guess. And I seem to recall in the history of food, you talked about the first example of animal husbandry being the humble snail as an interesting example of sometimes how fuzzy some of those categories of agriculture and technological advancement can be.
Yeah, it's a sort of philosopher's cop-out to say it all depends what you mean by agriculture. Of course, it does. Obviously, amongst your listeners are lots of people who know far more about Australian Aboriginals than I do. But obviously, they have long before Europeans appeared in Australia. Indigenous people, especially in the sort of Murray-Darling River basin area, did do a lot of planting. Well, sort of casual planting, in which you stick a nardoo root, back in the soil after you've eaten the edible part of it. And that is obviously, in a sense, husbandry. It's it doesn't necessarily involve tilling the soil, but it does involve selecting food sources for cultivation, because that's what you do when you replant them. And I think it does show that, as you rightly say, the dividing line between sort of pre-agriculture and agriculture is very fuzzy, and that one has to see the history of farming not in terms of sort of when it starts, but how it gradually emerges in a sort of process of co-evolution between our species, and the species that we have developed for our own purposes. Because to me, that's the essence of it. When you get a situation where there are a lot of species that are dependent on human cultivation for their own survival, then you're in a farming society. But of course, many societies, before they get to that point, and many of them perhaps very wisely never do, until you get to that point, you're going to get a lot of forms of cultivation along the way before you get to this situation where you can talk, I think, about sort of farming society or farming civilization.
And I guess that goes to your book about civilizations, which was from around about 2000 from memory. But in that book, first of all, you kind of talk about civilizations in the plural rather than, the rise of Western civilization alone sort of thing. And you have a particular viewpoint on civilization, that it's a kind of a process, and it's not progress, it's a process, and particularly it's the process of adapting the environment to human needs. But you also wrote that book, I seem to recall, like you said in the book, that it was a bit of a thought experiment on your part. I wonder what do you think about your book on civilizations 20 years later, especially now that the term civilization seems to be having a bit of a comeback in both a positive and a negative sense.
Well, of course, that was exactly what I was trying to avoid. I was trying to take the value, out of the word and ask, what does it really mean? It's applied most strictly, most meaningfully, most helpfully, when you use it and you get a sense, of what is special about the term, about the objects you're designating as civilizations. That's what I wanted to try and isolate and identify. So I rather regret it whenever I hear people using the word as a term of value and either saying, that some society is superior to another because it's a civilization, or alternatively saying civilization is terrible. In many ways, if you accept my definition of civilization as a process of the modification of the environment for human purposes, in many ways, it's a very bad thing. You were talking a moment ago about Australian Aboriginals. One of the very impressive things about those guys is that they managed to maintain recognisably a continuous way of life without interruption for scores of thousands of years. Perhaps still a lot of dispute about when Australia was first peopled, but you could be talking about 50,000 years of uninterrupted continuity. That's an amazing achievement. It's actually, most societies are very conservative. What they really want to do is just carry on the way they've always been. They don't want to change. They change in response to the pressures of necessity or to conquest from outside, or to cultural influence from outside. But typically people are conservative, and you've got to acknowledge that when they postpone or avoid change, they're actually succeeding, usually, according to their own lights. Whereas all these other societies that have meddled with the environment have provoked disasters and collapse, and they're all one with Nineveh and Tyre. And in a sense, I'm always saying history is a path picked across the ruins of these over-ambitious societies that have exhausted their own resources. And let's face it, we're well on the way to doing the same ourselves. So to some extent, I think it is proper to be cautionary about civilization, to remind people that it's not always the best plan. It depends what you want. If you want, to have a strenuous, troublesome way of life in which you're always trying to sort of cope with the demands of very sophisticated technologies and so on. Obviously, then civilization is for you. But if you'd rather, stick to your hunting and your gathering and your ancestral rituals and so on, then, for God's sake, try to leave Mother Nature intact. Don't meddle with the environment. Obviously, the distinctive thing in a way about my book was also that I approached the history of the world in that book according to biomes. So, because I was saying to myself, well, really history is about the relationship with the environment. So instead of thinking in terms of countries and cultures and continents and geographical areas, we should think about biomes. We should ask, how have people responded to the equipment, to the environment that nature has supplied? And, you find that people have certain strategies if they're living in arid deserts and certain strategies if they're living in high mountains and so on. But to me, the great revelation, and the thing that I learned from writing the book, was that people can be in pretty much the same environment and will respond to it in startlingly different ways. In other words, environment is not determinant. It shapes, it influences, it conditions the way we behave, but it does not determine the way we behave. So in a way, the message of the book is a message about freedom.
In that book, the traditional account of, I guess, the cradles of civilization and the rise of the West, etc., only occurs quite late in the book, and in the context of, I guess, the Atlantic and that sort of story. what do you make of the idea of Western civilization, which I guess in so much, I guess the popular imagination, let's say, is very much still a very deeply entrenched idea. And how do you, like, say, with your students in America, how do you engage with some of the inherited concepts, so to, the popular inherited concepts of the West and the rise of the West?
Well, I've no objection, to people being proud of the achievements of their ancestors, and I think it's a very good thing for people to be happy in their own cultures. Indeed, in many ways, that's one of the great blessings of life, as long as that happiness, that comfort, is based on truth, and you've got to, as long as you know that the history of the West has been streaked with blood and darkness, I think it's fine, to be very proud of the positive aspects of it. Because Christianity is really an Oriental religion which has been adopted by the West, but very successfully. And I work at a Catholic university because I'm a Spaniard. I am a Catholic. It's almost inevitable hazard of being a Spaniard is that you're a Catholic, and I'm very delighted with and proud of that identity, which I embrace very, very wholeheartedly. And I think that Christianity has had unfortunately, it hasn't had the effect on the world that it ought to have had, because people don't take enough notice of the message of love and peace. But in as far as you have taken notice of it, it's been a benign influence. So I start from the position that there's lots to celebrate in the history of the West. There's a lot of interest in the fact that we can talk about it at all, that all these different polities and communities have, in a sense, come to share a certain set of assumptions, a certain conception of themselves and of their relationship to the world. But obviously what goes wrong, I think, with the tradition of my discipline, or what has gone wrong with it in the past in this connection, is that people have focused on the West to the exclusion of other, very interesting and important traditions. And when that happens, you're being Westocentric or Eurocentric. I define Eurocentrism or Westocentrism as a focus on the West that is so all-absorbing and exclusive that it omits to do justice to everywhere else. So you ask me what I do with my students. Effectively, I tell them to, it's great, love America, love the West, huddle together with your fellow Westerners to, resist the menace of Mr. Putin or whatever. All that is excellent. But do it in awareness of the truth about your own past and that of other people's as well. I think, it's equally deplorable to be, like sort of the Islamic Caliphate guys, who think that they have all the truth and everybody else is inferior. I think it'd be equally wrong to have been like Genghis Khan, think, the Mongols are so great they ought to rule the entire world. Over ambition, over confidence isn't a Western vice. It's a human vice, and I think it's equally deplorable wherever it occurs.
And I think people have trouble with that, don't they, to both appreciate history, but yes, also recognise awful lot of bad things have been done by everyone in history over time.
Yes, you're right.
And sitting comfortably with that.
It's very strange that is the case. after all, we are all mixtures of virtues and vices, and if we're honest about ourselves, we may occasionally see something good, make life intolerable if we weren't sometimes pleased with ourselves. But we must, I mean, God, is it possible to be human and not to be aware that one's, well, my Catholic tradition, we'd say, is sinful. You haven't got a lot of, sort of things that you really ought to regret in your behaviour and your attitudes to other people, a lot of vices that are harmful to your own psyche as well. Everybody's like that. And therefore, it's inevitable that every human community and polity should also be like that, because they're all composed of people. And yet, it seems very hard for a lot of us to accept that our own communities' histories are disfigured by vice. And that whatever we've done collectively, or our ancestors did together in collaboration that is good, can only be understood. You can only understand that goodness if you compare it with the stuff that they got wrong. So why are people resistant to this? I suppose it's because of the pressures of competition. And we think that, if we make concessions to our rivals and competitors, we're weakening our own position. I'm not sure that's the case. I think that on the whole, if you start by examining your own faults, it's likely to make you better and stronger in the long run. But then, I don't think I'd be very successful if I attempted to go into politics.
Yes, well, I spent 30 years as a public servant, so, it's a difficult life, politics.